Ha'oliwa e ho'olana ya'u ko ya noa Hanohano Dolim. He polopeka hope oia ma ka polokalamu mo'olelo ma loko ke kununui o Hawaiʻi Mānoa. Ke hanane oia ma ke ia manawa ma ke alka'i kalai ana na ali'i wahine ma waho o na ka ena aupuni a ka lako ho'okumu ana i na ea ma waho no ho'e o ke kahi o puni o na aina e. Ma waina o ka hopena o ke kenikulia umi kumaiwa a me ka hopmaka o ke kenikulia iwakalua. He upena ke imi na au noa ke kahi pilipu i ke keka palahui ka kolonial noho pa'a a me na hana imperiala. Mai kunia wahu mai o noa a puna Hawaii ka aina o kona mo o au. Noa Hanohano Dolim is an assistant professor of history at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Noa's current project centers on ali'i wahine political leadership outside of formal government institutions and their creation of sovereignties beyond the nation state between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His research attends to the intersection of gender, race, settler colonialism, and imperialism. Noa is from Kunia, Oahu, and has ancestral ties to Puna, Hawaii. I'll only add that Noa is one of the most prominent young scholars directing their attention to Kānaka Ōiwi insistence, resistance, and survivance in the late kingdom, and especially the territorial period in Hawaii, and that I've been very much looking forward to hearing his presentation today. Noa.
Thanks so much, Craig, Caroline, Keone, and the rest of the staff from the Center of Biographical Research for putting this talk together, making a beautiful poster that I could never do myself. And thank you to the long list of co-sponsors. It's great to see support for Hawaiian historical research. And of course, thank you all for coming out in the middle of the semester when things are starting to get pretty hectic as well. And I've been greatly looking forward to this presentation because I get to fully embrace the spirit of biographical research and give my attention to a historical figure that I've spent a lot of time with in the archives over the past 5-6 years of my life. So the goal of my presentation is twofold. First, to introduce you to Emma Ahu and some of the key moments of her life. And second, to use these moments to illuminate broader historical and historiographic themes and questions that I've been thinking through, grappling with, don't know the answer to yet. And so I've divided our time here today into 4 different sections. I'll begin with the introduction and overview of my broader research project and the process which led me to Emma Ahu ena as a central figure. Then I'll actually introduce you to Emma Ahu ena, as well as her mother, Mary Jane Montano. And why the ali'i of their time were regarded as bridges and links between the 2 centuries. In a third section, I'll discuss how Emma's personal and professional lives intersected with settler politics during the territorial era. And then finally, I'll end with one of the greatest stories that you've never heard. My talk today is an offshoot of my current project about ali'i wahine in the 19th and early 20th centuries, who built and maintained Native Hawaiian sovereignties beyond the nation-state framework. And I argue that ali'i wahine developed alternative paths of political leadership outside of these outside of the formal government structure. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by formal soon. Often overlooked and obscured by their male counterparts, these chiefly women organized vigorously for Hawaiian education, public health, suffrage, cultural preservation, and history making, both prior to and in the wake of the US-backed overthrow of Hawaii, as well as the illegal annexation. They built women's clubs and mixed-gender societies that drew upon authoritative genealogical, marital, and social networks. These women were invaluable in their contributions to Ho'ulu Ahu to grow and give life to the Hawaiian nation. And so my research also tracks change and continuity from the 19th century into the early 20th century. This periodization was not intentional when I first started the project. It was supposed to be like 90% in the kingdom and like the last 10% in the early 20th century. And then when I was going through the archives, I realized how flawed that was going to be, especially once I started mapping out these networks of Hawaiian women. So it ended up being, as you can see by this little timeline, almost the opposite, where almost one and a half the paper or the project is actually in the early 20th century rather than being on the other side of that century mark. And where this archive of Ali'i Wahine took me is really a reflection and testament to the rapidly changing Hawaiian world at the end of the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, serious concerns over public health, education, cultural preservation, poverty, land dispossession proved to be a catalyst for these women to organize both individually and collectively. In the preliminary stages of this project, I intentionally moved away from two of the more well-known stories about Ali'i Wahine. So of course, Queen Emma and the creation of Queen's Hospital, and then Pauahi and Kamehameha schools. And not that they're important, I think there's more of a public recognition of their work. But of course, these two women definitely shaped the world that I was trying to step into. Emma and Pauahi both had legitimate claims to the throne. However, they never served as mo'i, as sovereign of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Nor were they appointed or elected, or they were never appointed or elected into any position within the government as well. So not in the House of Nobles, not as governors, not as ministers. And here I'm trying to make the point. I'm also trying to make the point and make sure that we remember that these women were ali'i not because of the kingdom. Their status and rights as chiefs were tied to a genealogy which connected them to the cosmos, to the pole, right? So it predates the Hawaiian Kingdom by thousands and thousands of years. But on the other side, it persisted through the kingdom, through the republic, and into the territory. And my aim was to track down what other Ali'i Wahine were doing, especially those who are not in line to become mo'i, which included those from parallel lineages, genealogies, those from lower ranks, and those definitely not directly associated with the Kamehamehas or the Kalakawas. And the Kānaka at the focal point of this talk, Emma Ahu ena, is one of these ali'i. And so I first came across Emma Ahu ena in the early stages of research, when I was simply gathering a list of names of prominent Hawaiian women. If you're familiar with the book Notable Women of Hawaii, that was my starting point. Just flipping through what women are Hawaiian and which women are living across the century mark. I literally started from that book and just made a list, and I took that to the archive. And from that list, I went down the proverbial rabbit hole. This small list of names turned into a deeply complex web of relationships and life histories. Emma immediately stood out to me because her collection at the Hawaii State Archives is exceptionally robust. A, for being a Hawaiian woman in an institutional archive, or in a governmental archive, and B, for being a non-monarch, non-politician. This project has truly illuminated the racialized, gendered, and class politics of the archive, particularly of those whose lives have been deemed as worthy of preserving. As scholar Achilles Membe has suggested, even if one is preserved, there's also sort of death, or I think of it as like a purgatory, for those lives who become cataloged in this archival perpetuity. And here I'm not claiming to be like a magical necromancer raising people from the dead for the sake of telling a cool story. But what I'm really trying to do is present these histories in meaningful and critical ways that both support and challenge our ideas of the Hawaiian past and Hawaii broadly. So enough about the boring research process. We get to the fun parts, okay? So let me introduce you to Emma Ahu ena. Her ancestral lineage traces back to her great-grandmother Ahia, who married British sea captain George Beckley. Ahia was from Kohala on Hawaii Island and descended from a line of ali'i and warriors who had supported Kamehameha the First. Beckley, George Beckley, after settling in Hawaii in the early 1800s, became a trusted advisor of Kamehameha on Kamehameha's military and diplomatic campaign to unify the islands. So that's why Beckley was able to marry into these ali'i lines as a trusted advisor. And together, Ahia and Beckley became the progenitors of the very large Beckley family. There's streets named after them, right? Mary Kekahimoku Beckley, daughter of Ahia and George, married Abram Henry Fairweather, and two of their daughters became very well known in the Honolulu community. Julia Fairweather and her husband Chan Ah-Fong, a wealthy Chinese businessman and politician, established the notable Ah-Fong family, which stretched between Hawaii and China. And I'm going to ask you to remember that point because it'll come back in that story that I'm going to tell you. And Julia's sister, Mary Jane Fairweather, married American pharmacist Benomi Davison, and together they had 5 children. William Compton Malulani, Rose Compton, Henry Fairweather, Marie Hope Kekulani, and of course, Emma Ahu ena. After Benomi's passing, this is Mary Jane's husband, Mary Jane remarried to Colombian photographer Andres Avelino A.A. Montano, who was a photographer, and he was most remembered for taking studio portraits of Ali'i during this period, during that kingdom period. So this is a photograph of Kapi'olani, but it was taken by A.A. Montano. And also the pictures of Pauahi and Emma are also A.A. Montano photographs as well. So if you do any research during that time and you do visual culture, it's pretty much sure that you'll run into one of his photographs at some point of these Ali'i. And so Mary Jane Montano was an incredible influence on Emma's life, not just as a mother, but as a teacher. Montano herself was looked upon as a source of historical and cultural knowledge in the early 20th century. From December 1923 to January 1924, the Honolulu Advertiser published a 5-part series of her recollections in the newspaper. And I really suggest, if you're interested in just hearing kind of narrative of the Hawaiian Kingdom in early 20th century, from the ground level, really would suggest reading those recollections. In addition to Mary Jane's passion for history, she also composed 2 classic 20th century Hawaiian mele, Old Plantation, Ku'uhome, and Beautiful Kahana for her lifelong friends. The first references the magnificent estate of the Ali'i Victoria Robinson Ward and her husband Curtis P. Ward, which is now, of course, the current site of the Neil Blaisdell Center. So this is their house, Old Plantation. Beautiful house. And this is 1950. This was the year that Old Plantation was torn down by the city. And they had a 2-day open house where you could actually tour the grounds, and I think just the bottom floor of the house. The second song was written for Victoria's older sister, Mary Elizabeth Mikahala Robinson Foster. Mary's husband, Thomas Foster, was the founder of the Inter-Island Steamship Navigation Company. Their residence on the corner of Nu'uanu and Vineyard became the Foster Botanical Gardens. And Mary Foster owned nearly all the land in Kahana Valley, of which the mele, Beautiful Kahana, talks about its splendor. Born in 1867, Emma Ahu ena inherited her mother's expertise in the history of their family and their people. Her inoa Ahu ena was given in honor of this heiau, located at Kamakahonu Kona on the island of Hawaii. And this heiau was restored by Kamehameha Ekahi post 1810, and Kamehameha lived in the area of Kamakahonu, and that's also where Kamehameha passed away as well. During a trip to Kona in her youth, Emma and her mother visited the revered ali'i wahine, Ruth Ke'elikolani. And Emma recalls, and this is from Emma's own recollections, that Ruth sent my mother over with me to place a lehua lei on the heiau of Ahu ena at Kamakahonu, so that I would respect and understand the sacredness of the name I bear. In her adult life, Emma was active in a multitude of Honolulu societies, such as the Outdoor Circle, League of Women Voters, the Republican Club, and was remembered as an officer and moving force within the Hawaiian Historical Society. She served as a member of the short-lived but very influential Hawaiian Historical Commission, replacing Prince Kuhio Kalanianaole in 1922 after his death. And as a member of the Hawaiian Legend and Folklore Commission, she assisted with the translation of the 19th century historian Samuel M. Kamaka's newspaper series, Kama'olelo Hawaii, Kama'olelo o Kamehameha Ekahi, and Kama'olelo o Na Kamehameha, those 3 newspaper series, which of course became Ruling Chiefs. And we don't get into the issues with Ruling Chiefs, but just know that she was a part of that translation project early on. I also must mention that Mary Jane and Emma Ahu ena have direct ties to Mānoa Valley. Mary Jane and A.A. Montano had a dairy farm at a place named Ka'aipu, which was near the Lowry-Manoa intersection, so I guess somewhere where the tea house was, or tea house is now. Mary Jane also owned property in Mauka of the Manoa East Manoa intersection, and also if you know how there's that split and there's that little triangle park up there, that was also part of their property that they donated to the city. Mary Jane was also responsible for the naming of Kamanele Park, which was dedicated in 1915, and of course Kamanele is the park right in the dip by the entrance to Midpac. And thank you, Kale. We were talking about this last year, because I was like, it's part of the bigger project. But Kale came across this article about the dedication of the park. And of course, who was there in 1915? Liliuokalani was there at the park 2 years before her death. And the name Kamanele is actually a name of a ali'i wahine who once lived in this valley and had fish ponds in the lower part of the valley. And Mary Jane Matana wanted to honor her as a resident of the valley. Emma Ahu ena, including her mother, were part of a generation or 2 generations of ali'i who lived significant portions of their lives on either side of the century mark. The turn from the 19th century into the 20th century was one of the greatest eras of worldwide change, shifting global politics and economies paired with massive technological advances. In Hawaii, it marked the island's transition from native monarchy to settler republic to American colonial possession. Despite these changes, Emma and her ali'i contemporaries were anchors of continuity in Hawaiian leadership. And you know, as I got to learn more about Emma and a lot of her other ali'i contemporaries, I thought about, you know, how much change they saw in their lifetime. So I pulled this picture specifically. This was the first survey flight to Hawaii, 1935 by Pan American Airlines. And there have been planes in Hawaii before, but you know, as a marker of like commercial flight, which we unfortunately rely on so much in Hawaii. But you know, undoubtedly Emma saw this plane. This was 2 years before her own passing. So this, again, just to kind of think of the range that they saw within their lifetime across the 2 centuries. One person who helped me really contextualize these intercentury ali'i is the late columnist Samuel Crowningberg Amalu, of all people. An eccentric character in the second half of the 20th century, Amalu was of ali'i descent and gained notoriety for his various financial schemes, which ended up landing in prison, in Folsom Prison in California. Incarcerated, Amalu wrote letters to his Punahou classmate, Thurston Twig Smith, who was the editor of Honolulu Advertiser. And Twig Smith began publishing Sammy's letters and columns, or his letters as newspaper columns. And this continued even after Samuel Amalu was released from Folsom in 1970. So he had a pretty decent writing career in the Advertiser. And Amalu's columns covered a diverse range of topics, but usually centered around Hawaiian history, genealogy, his own family, other ali'i, and he has some kind of like, again, go read his articles. They're pretty funny too. He has a very unique style of writing. So in 1967, while still in Folsom, so this is the top article, Sammy wrote about the celebration of the Kamehameha Day holiday, and he provides a genealogy of ali'i and their contributions from the time of Kamehameha Kahi all the way to his present in the 20th century. In regards to the chiefs of the early 20th century, Amalu writes that, quote, that they helped their people traverse the abyss that separated their own ancient culture from a new and overpowering civilization. The ali'i bridged this abyss and led the Hawaiian people safely across into a new world. They did this by accepting all the new world had to offer and yet retaining all that was precious and lovely of the old, a feat not matched in the history of man.
That's sad.
Yeah, that's sad. And so here Amalu reflects on the impact of change, but also the power of continuity. And how did the Lahui weather the tides of change at the turn of the century? As we know through the work of Noinoe Silva, Daviana McGregor, and so many other scholars who have built upon that foundation, Hawaiians, both ali'i and Maka'inano, didn't just roll over, they persisted. They knew when to be malleable, they knew when to stand firm, and for all intents and purposes, we are the evidence of that continuity. 13 years later, in 1980, Samuel Amalu would publish another holiday article, this time titled Hawaiian Mothers of a Special Brand. Amalu explained that he would usually talk about his own mother on this Mother's Day column, but this year he was choosing to, quote, write of other mothers and maybe even of some women who, though they never had children of their own, were nevertheless capable of playing the motherly role. So on this slide are all of the wahine that Amalu references in this article, including Emma Ahu ena Taylor. And I will say he also mentioned Emma Ahu ena in the Kamehameha Day article as well. So in this list, some names might look familiar. We're talking about philanthropists, humanitarians, entrepreneurs, musicians, historians, cultural practitioners, politicians, educators, and probably 20 other labels that I couldn't fit into this presentation. Amalu himself knew some of these women personally and grew up around them, or they might have been related to him, or from adjacent ali'i lines. And Amalu describes the ali'i wahine within a gendered role as makuahine, as mothers. And although this might seem simple or a very essential description of womanhood, the ability of ali'i, regardless of gender, to ho'omakua, to become or act as a parent, is a concept that was definitely expressed in the 19th century by Mākainana themselves, and can subsequently be seen in older mo'olelo as well. And so the pilina between ali'i and Mākainana was sometimes couched in this parent-child relationship, or as in this gender-specific case, as mothers of the nation. Amalu goes on to explain that it was these ali'i wahine who rose up in response to the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, U.S. annexation, and to the increasing power of what he calls the plutocracy or haole elite. In doing so, they, quote, refused to take a back seat in civic and business affairs, but fought tooth and nail for their own rights and the rights of their people. And of course, I wholeheartedly agree with Amalu's analysis on the intent and efficacy of ali'i wahine labor. However, in the context of my own work, I'm pushing for the actions and labor of ali'i wahine to be recognized as a continuity of kuleana, rather than simply just a reaction to 1893 and 1898. And so, of course, it's, like I showed you in the other slide, extending that timeline deeper into the past, and of course forward, in order to acknowledge their roles as these bridges and links. So as an overeager graduate student not too long ago, I found myself at the Bishop Museum archives requesting an incessant amount of photographs of this woman, Lahilahi Webb, who was a frequent collaborator and friend of Emma Ahu ena. Webb was the last lady in waiting for Queen Liliuokalani at the end of her life, and then transitioned into a nearly 30-year career at Bishop Museum as a cultural consultant and docent kind of figure. So I'm sitting there, I have this growing stack of photographs that I don't know what I'm gonna do with, but at that point I thought I needed them. And DeSoto Brown walks by, and DeSoto is the historian archivist in the archives, and he's like, what are you doing? And so I gave him that was very early on in the process, so I gave him a half-baked idea of my dissertation at that point. And he told me something that was very important in that stage of the research. He said, and I'm paraphrasing what he said. He says, Hawaiian women like Lahilahi Webb, and actually not just Hawaiian women, but also other Hawaiian men who were prominent during the Hawaiian Kingdom, they took on a new status and prominence in the 20th century as these historical and cultural authorities. So it's almost like they had two different lives across the century mark. And the concern for preserving Hawaiian culture and history became a priority not only for Native Hawaiians, but also the settler state. And this is none more evident than in Emma's personal and professional relationships. Whereas some ali'i wahine were easier to track down in the archive across both centuries, Emma doesn't really appear in the archive to the real late in the century, almost at the 1900 mark, as a bachelorette going to various social events around Honolulu. So parties, balls, luau. They'd post all the people who attended, and she'd always be in the crowd at these events. However, one of the major turns in her life was her marriage in 1902 to a man named Albert Pierce Taylor. So this is the marriage announcement in Kunupepa in 1902. They got married at Mary Jane's house in Mānoa. Albert Pierce Taylor, who moved to Hawaii in 1898, worked as a secretary in Washington, D.C. for the Hawaii Annexation Commission. He then assumed positions as a prolific writer for the Honolulu Advertiser and as a second archivist for the Territorial, or for the Archives of Hawaii, which is what it was called back then. His work as an archivist and historian put him in the same professional circles as other Haole settler intellectuals, such as Herbert Gregory from the Bishop Museum, Henry Restorick, who is the president of the Hawaiian Historical Society, and of course, Ralph Kaikendall. Taylor's writings largely centered on various aspects of Hawaiian history, and his most celebrated work was his 1926 book titled Under Hawaiian Skies. His intimate knowledge of Hawaiian history, culture, and society was undoubtedly influenced by his marriage to Emma Ahu ena and his access to her mother, Mary Jane Matano. So even if you ever borrow this book, I don't know if I did part of the book, but if you want to part of this book, the opening page is actually a translated mele composed by Mary J. Montano. And so while A.P. Taylor was building his career, Emma Ahu ena was emerging as a well-respected cultural authority. This is about the same time that she's a member of the Hawaiian Historical Commission and the Hawaiian Folklore Commission. And in my research, I'm particularly interested in Emma's work in cultural preservation and performance as a member of the Royal Society Ahu ena, the Daughters and Sons of Hawaiian Warriors, which she led from 1920 and into the 1930s. And she actually took over leadership from Alice Kamakila Campbell, who was leading that organization. Her experiential knowledge as an elite wahine in that intercentury period, combined with being the daughter of Mary J. Montano, made her frequently sought after by the general public and the territorial government itself. And this is a photo that I always love. It's Emma Ahu ena Taylor, her cousin F.W. Kahopula Beckley, and this is actually at the funeral for Prince Kuhio in 1922. So this is Mānoa, and then that's the Kalakaua crypt on the right side. On one hand, Hawaiians were trying to maintain and practice cultural knowledge, but at the same time, the settler state, supported by these intellectuals like her husband, were enraptured in this colonial nostalgia, which resulted in the desire to preserve specific parts of Hawaiian history and culture that it either served to legitimize colonialism or had value in the growing tourist economy. One of my chapters takes on this type of strange bedfellows relationship in which I examined the 1928 Captain Cook Sesquicentennial, which was conceived of by Albert Pierce Taylor and sponsored by the Territorial Legislature. The purpose of the celebration was, of course, to memorialize Cook's discovery of Hawaii, and as I argue, for the settler state to claim Cook as a white ancestor. Yet A.P. Taylor and his collaborators needed just enough Native Hawaiian participation to uphold their version of the truth. They did this by encouraging Curtis Piahu Iokea to become the commissioner of the Sesquicentennial. Iokea had vast governmental experience and historical knowledge through his decades of service through the kingdom, the republic, and the territory. So you have, this is the whole Sesquicentennial, or most of the Sesquicentennial commission. 1930, when they dedicate the Cook plaque, which is in front of the old archives building on the grounds of Iolani Palace. So A.P. Taylor is in the dark jacket on the left, and then Curtis Iokea is third from the right there. In the book, The Queen and I, scholar Sidney Iokea gives us a very powerful but haunting analysis. She writes, Curtis P. Iokea was celebrated as a Hawaiian who survived the monarchy and lived to tell about it. He was also regarded as representing all that was apparently good about becoming American. And even so, the territorial government regularly drew on his memories to close the gap between the Hawaiian Kingdom and the territory, and in order to legitimize its own existence in the process. It needed to insert its inevitability into the historical narrative and use her great-great-grandfather's public memories to represent its evidence of inheritance. So this dire thirst for validation through the Hawaiian past and present speaks of the fragility of settler colonialism and imperialism. And yet it's the same reliance on Hawaiian intellectual and cultural labor that offered spaces for Native Hawaiians themselves to assert control over knowledge production in Hawaii during that territorial period. As part of the 1928 Cook Sesquicentennial, Emma Ahu ena was hired as the cultural consultant on a full-scale reenactment of Captain Cook's arrival, which was viewed by thousands of spectators, 2 nights. I think it was like 5,000 people each night. And she brought the aforementioned Lahi Lahi Web to help her and casted members from Ahu ena Māmakakaua as well as the Waikiki Beach Boys. So on the left is the actual letter between Emma and Curtis. They're really good friends, in which Curtis asks Emma Ahu ena on behalf of Ahu ena Māmakakaua to participate in as part of the Cook Sesquicentennial, and particularly in that reenactment. And then I was able to actually find the tickets when I went back to the archive last year for this reenactment at Hamo Waikiki. And Hamo is the former estate of Lady Kalani. Yep. And here I argue that even within this obviously colonial celebration, Ahu ena and other Kānaka use this moment to literally stage the preservation and continued practice of culture through the medium of performance. And I'd also like to point out that under Emma's leadership, Ahu ena Mānoa did a lot of public-facing performance, engagement, whether it was ceremonial, educational, or entertainment. So of course, like Kānaka Ōiwi's funeral, but also did like parades. They did a whole bunch of other type of historical reenactments all throughout that period under Emma Ahu ena's leadership. And so earlier in this presentation, I used the word exceptional to describe Emma Ahu ena Taylor. First, her archival presence, which is larger in comparison to many of her elite wahine contemporaries, and undoubtedly being married to the archivist kind of helped with that. And second is her writing production, which I turn to in this final part of my presentation. In the early 20th century, Emma was also able to write and publish more often than her contemporaries. Her articles on history and culture have been featured in publications such as the Paradise of the Pacific, which later became Honolulu Magazine, and in the papers of the Hawaiian Historical Society. And like her mother, Mary Jane, Emma also penned her own personal recollections as a 10-part series published in a Star Bulletin in 1935. And again, just like her mother's recollections, I also would highly suggest reading Emma Ahu ena's own. However, her most substantial body of writing was never published and remains in the purgatory of the archive. Sometime between 1926 and 1931, Emma Ahu ena authored a 250-page typewritten manuscript for a historical fiction novel. I'll let that sit with all the English people. Titled From Brilliant Feathered Cape to Eagle, the story spans between 1892 and 1900, from the final days of the kingdom into American territoriality. And of course, the title itself alludes to the symbols of each nation, right? The Ahu ena, the feathered cape of the chief of the Ali'i, and of course the eagle for America. And in between the main storyline are many references to Emma's own life and those around her, such as the Ward family, right, that was close to her mother and that she grew up around. And then for, if anybody's a fan of Emma Ahu ena, who was, they're technically, I guess, cousins. Or Emma Ahu ena had married her cousin. Yeah. And another prominent historian writer in that time. And so the fast-paced story begins with an American soldier named Compton Beckley, who learns he's part Hawaiian right before departing to Hawaii on none other than the USS Boston. Beckley has these frequent supernatural visions of a spear-wielding warrior wearing a helmet, cape, and a leiniho palau, the well-toothed pendant. In Hawaii, a family of Ali'i descent takes Beckley under their wing. There's Ululani, the wife, her husband Kealoha, and then their daughter named Kulani. And Beckley, the soldier, starts to see the very tangible friction within the kingdom between the royalists and those who seek to depose of Mili'uokalani. The antagonist of the story is a Haole businessman named Carl Bering, who tries to infiltrate the royalist circles and constantly harasses this Hawaiian family. A flashback explains his villain origin story. When he was young, he had deserted his ship and was subsequently taken in by a Hawaiian family from Mānoa. He was given his own land, married a wahine, and eventually became a successful businessman. When his Hanai family and others needed money to pay for their property, he gave them a series of loans. You can see where this is about to go. One day, he returns with a lawyer, and he swindles the Hawaiian families out of their lands in the valley. He ditches his wife and his child, and he tries to pursue a then young Ululani, so the other protagonist of the story, but she rejects him. And so thus the bad blood between Bering and Ululani's family had these deep roots. The political friction comes to a head, and Compton Beckley reluctantly is deployed to support the new provisional government as one of the Marines from the USS Boston. Ululani and her family are so devastated that they decide to leave the islands. While boarding the ship, and they're actually sent off by Emma Ahu ena in the story, Bering is also kind of like creeping the harbor or the port, and he declares to the family, "This is my Hawaii, not yours." The next act details the family's travel through the US, through Europe, and then finally stopping in Hong Kong, China. And you're probably wondering, why would Emma Ahu ena make this Hawaiian family end up in China? And this is the part where I told you to remember her genealogy. If you remember, Emma's Auntie Julia Fairweather had married the Chinese businessman and politician Chan Ah Fong. In 1890, the real 1890, Ah Fong and his oldest son, Tony, permanently moved back to China. In the manuscript, the family reconnects with their Chinese relatives. Ululani, fearing that her daughter Kulani would grow disconnected from their culture, reveals this kapa bundle, which has an ahugla in it, that was passed down to their family. In 1895, Ululani receives a letter recounting the Wilcox Rebellion. She reads that A.A. Montano supported the Republic and offered to host soldiers at their house. And this is Emma Ahu ena writing, right, the manuscript. She says, much to the dismay of his stepdaughters. So she's referring to herself and her sisters. And this was actually in Emma's recollections in the newspapers. This is the same story that she tells in the newspaper as well. And she was not happy about her stepfather. I don't think they got along at all. But she was really quick to criticize him for this action. But unfortunately, Ululani is so distraught by the outcome of Wilcox's rebellion that she dies of heartbreak in the story. Sometime in the later part of 1898, presumably after annexation, Kealoha is now set on returning to Hawaii with his daughter Kulani. He laments that the Hawaiian Kingdom has lost, but he explains, quote, one thing remains, the Hawaiians become unconquered Americans. We are in the majority politically and will wield a powerful scepter there. True to the style of abrupt turns in this story, the Boxer Rebellion breaks out in China. It's 1899. And Kealoha, the husband, the father, is murdered in the street, mirroring the real-life political assassination of Tony Ah Fong's son in 1924. So this is not the Boxer Rebellion anymore, but this was, Tony Ah Fong's son was shot, I think it was actually a year earlier, and he succumbed to his wounds in 1924. So Emma uses that in the story, in Kealoha's murder in the street. And then soon the violence of the rebellion literally reaches the family's doorstep. Their house is surrounded by the Boxers. Kulani, the daughter, looks over at the wall. She sees this image of a Hawaiian warrior climbing over the wall with his helmet and his cape. And she looks a little bit closer. The illusion disappears, and of course it's Compton Beckley coming over the wall. And Compton Beckley happened to be part of the contingent of US Marines deployed to suppress the Boxer Rebellion. And so Kulani shows Beckley the Ahu ena and also reveals that there's a helmet and palawa in her mother's stash. She tells him of her lineage to Ahia, and he professes his love and asks her to marry. On their return to Hawaii, Carl Baring is also aboard the ship. He tries to plant opium on Kulani, the daughter. The plan is foiled, and he ends his life by jumping into the water. In the closing pages, the couple gets married at Hawaiʻi Church, surprise, surprise. And it's finally acknowledged that Compton and Kulani are cousins. And they definitely knew about that they're related from the objects in the story. And so it's a very Hawaiian story as well. And this abbreviated plot recounted does zero justice to the richness and depth of Emma's manuscript. But I do want to draw attention to the major narrative and stylistic themes that give unique glimpses not only into Emma's life, but also the broader history of Hawaii. So first, of course, the protagonist family is made up of composite characters based on Emma's real Beckley Ahia lineage, and even using combinations of real names like Compton Beckley. The daughter Kulani is from her mother's name and her sister's name. And this is a common theme actually across Emma's writing. She also, both published and unpublished, she was always incredibly proud of her genealogy to Beckley and to Ahia, and of course of being Hawaiian. Second is her very direct and open criticism of the Haole elite who conspired against Liliuokalani. And of course she does this through that character of Carl Baring, the sugar planter, who swindles that Hawaiian family out of their lands. And I think it's so fascinating to hear this kind of critique from somebody like Emma Ahu ena, who's obviously, as in the previous section, who's very much working alongside the settler government and these officials, and even some of the same people who were part of the overthrow and facilitated annexation, like her husband. And also thinking about that she's writing this almost 25, 30 years later. What does that mean for somebody to be that open in their critique at that time? Again, Unfortunately, it didn't get published and we didn't get a public reaction to it, but it's something that I've been thinking about. And finally, and most complicatedly, and this is in my own words, is this sense of conditional acceptance of Americanness. And I mean this in the broadest of ways because I don't know what the concept of Americanness meant to Ahu ena herself, and I don't want to put words into her mouth. And of course, I'm referring to that line that Kealoha utters about being unconquered Americans. And then there's other examples of kind of Emma's perspective about the territory of America, of overthrow, annexation in some of her other writings. And of course, it's a shame that this manuscript was never published. And it's a stark reminder that as exceptional as Emma Ahu ena was, her husband's work was often obscured her husband's work often obscured her own, whereas that book, Under Hawaiian Skies, it was celebrated. Every time somebody would mention A.B. Taylor, it's like, oh, he wrote, Under Hawaiian Skies, blah, 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 blah. And this is a phenomenon that was not uncommon for this period of Hawaiian historical production that was monopolized by these settler writers. And I really hope that there's an opportunity in the not so distant future for this manuscript to live a life outside of the archives with the right people involved, the right intentions. I think it's that important to our understanding of both the Hawaiian Kingdom and the 20th century. And so in lieu of the standard academic conclusion, I really wanted to honor Emma Ahu ena Taylor as an ali'i wahine, as a historian, as a community organizer, and as a native Hawaiian who had a tremendous impact in and beyond the archives. And so days before her 70th birthday in 1937, Emma Ahu ena Taylor tragically passed away at the Queen's Hospital after a serious fall. This unexpected loss was a shock to the Hawaiian and local community. Just a month prior, she had assisted the boys and girls of the Kamehameha schools in preparing a scene depicting ancient Hawaiian life. The girls demonstrated kapa making, lei making, and lauhala weaving, and the boys demonstrated sports, ku'iai, or the making, the pa'iai, the pounding, and then net making. Ahu ena's passing was front page news in Hawaii and even reached newspaper columns in Oakland and Reno. An obituary described Ahu ena as, quote, of the few remaining links between old Hawaii and new Hawaii. Her death is a community loss, and particularly so because many of the things she represented are passing fast. This sense of urgency and responsibility is what drove her and so many other Native Hawaiians to be those critical keepers of the flame, regardless of their status. And it was said that the skies wept while the women and men of Ahuhui Makakao, adorned with red and yellow ahu ula, presided over the funeral service of their longtime leader and beloved ali'i wahine. At the historic Oahu Cemetery in Nu'uanu, Emma Ahu ena Taylor rests alongside many of the women that she called friends and family. Her mother, Mary Jane Montano, her sister, Julia Fairweather Afong, but also Alice Kamukila Campbell, Wilhelmina Kekelokalani Dowsett, Princess Elizabeth Kalaniana Ole, Emily Weidman McFarlane, Emma Nakuina, her cousin, Eugenia Maluhi Race, and of course her dear friend Lahi Lahi Webb. And so I end my presentation there. Thank you very much for listening and taking time out of your day.